Good morning, everyone. Just going to let people filter in for just a moment. It's great to see some familiar faces in here. All right, well, I'll just get going. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'd like to start by just doing a quick brief overview to the Zoom functionality so you can best navigate the tools on this webinar. I'm sure you're all familiar at this point with Zoom, but just for those who aren't, and then I'll briefly go into the introduction to the speakers and the flow of today's workshop. So my colleague Megan Fowler and I are going to be your tech supports today. If you're having any difficulty at all, just send us a private chat there in the chat box and we can help you out throughout the call. We're going to keep you all on mute today to keep things a little bit less chaotic. We do encourage you all to turn on your video for networking purposes if you're comfortable. No need to if you're not. The participants button there allows you to view a list of the other participants on the call so you can see who's with us from your state. And the chat button, the one that looks like a little thought bubble, this one's really important. We encourage you to pop that open. The moderators will be sharing links and information with the group in the chat. And to view it, you'll just click it and a sidebar is going to pop up. You can also use the chat box to pose any questions or comments that you have throughout the presentation. And we have a bunch of opportunity for Q&A today. So we're going to do our best to get to everyone's questions during those sections of the agenda. And notice the drop down that allows you to chat to either everybody or privately to an individual. Just to note too, the presentation today is being recorded and we'll make that available on AFT's website along with the resource handout with resources that will be mentioned by today's speakers. Today we're also going to be running a few polls to gauge where the audience is at and to keep you all on your toes. So we're actually going to start with our first one now. If you can take a minute, we just want to get a sense of who is here in the room with us. You'll wait a few more seconds, let folks fill that out. Okay, and the poll here. Oops, let's see, share results. All right, interesting. So really great mix of folks. We've got some municipal volunteers and staff, some land trust folks, about a third of you are nonprofit service providers. We've got some regional planners and state agency staff and some solar industry folks and some other. So really nice diverse mix of folks. That's great. So I just want to extend a formal welcome to the third webinar of the Farms for the Future project. And today's webinar is Solar Siting and Farmland. My name is Jamie Pottern. I'm the New England Program Manager at American Farmland Trust. And myself and my colleague Emily Cole, who you'll be hearing from in a minute, are going to be your MCs for the next 90 minutes. So this workshop series, just a little background, this was created through the partnership and really incredible organizing efforts of the following people and organizations. My colleague Megan Fowler and myself at AFT, Stephanie Morningstar at the Northeast Farmers Land Trust, she's here on the call today. She can wave if she's able. Meg Quinn at Maine Farmland Trust, Jeremy Lucci at the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, Nancy Everhart, who's also here on the call today with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And this project was generously funded by Jane's Trust. So we're also joined today by some really wonderful guest speakers who are working at the intersection of solar, climate change, and farmland protection in our region. We've got my colleague Emily Cole, who's AFT's New England Climate and Agriculture Program Manager, Jake Marley, the manager at Hyperion Systems LLC, Alex DePillis, Senior Ag Development Coordinator at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, very long title, and Tyler Miller, who's Vice President for Stewardship at the Vermont Land Trust. So real powerhouse group of folks, and we're so excited to have you all on today. So just a bit about the webinar series. I'm so excited to have some of you back. I see some familiar names of those who've been on some of our previous workshops. But today's webinar is the third in a 5-part series of educational workshops that we have designed specifically for land trusts, municipalities, and other nonprofits and service providers in Vermont and the other northern New England states. And really for folks who just want to better understand how to support farms and farmers in their communities. And I've said this on the other calls, you know, especially due to COVID-19 pandemic, there just appears to be a real growing interest in local agriculture, a real desire for more skills and training for securing a more resilient food system at the local level, as well as advancing greater land justice in our communities. So therefore, each workshop, we really designed these to offer some core content, some state-specific tools and resources, question and answer session, and some networking opportunities. And each workshop actually has built off of the previous one. And so we really do encourage you, if you didn't make the ones that came before this, to try to go back and watch them, to try to attend as many of these as possible. And as I mentioned before, the recordings will be made available on AFT's website. So the first workshop offered a broad overview of the principles and tools for developing more farm-friendly communities. Last week's workshop dug into specific tools for protecting farmland. Today's is about solar siting and options and considerations on farmland. Next week, we hope you'll come back. You'll have the opportunity to learn about making farmland available to farmers. And then the week after that, how to support Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. So full suite of great workshops, and we'll go over the dates of these and other related upcoming workshops at the end of the presentation. So before I hand it off to Emily, I'll just do a quick overview of the agenda. So as I mentioned, Emily's gonna share her extensive knowledge on the landscape of solar siting on farmland in New England and AFT's position and work in this space, as well as some best practices and approaches. Alex Apillis will provide an overview of some land use and siting policies in Vermont. Tyler Miller will talk about solar options on conserved land. We'll then do a Q&A with the both of them, followed by a presentation and Q&A with Jake Marley about some of the economics of small-scale solar on farmland. We'll wrap up with some sharing some upcoming workshops, and we're going to try to end by 10:30 and send you all on your way to the rest of your day. So sort of rapid fire overview there, but without further ado, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Emily Cole with AFT.
Thank you, Jamie. And just quick note, we hope to get you out of here by 11:30.
Oh, sorry, 11:30.
I don't think I can talk that fast. I can talk fairly fast, but. My
apologies there. Go ahead, Em.
Thanks, Jamie. Welcome everybody for coming today to hear more about what AFT is doing, but also more about what is really happening around your own state of Vermont in terms of solar siting and farmland protection, and trying to get a gauge of where are there some opportunities and where are there some caution signs that perhaps need to be thrown up, just so that we move slowly and in a more planned, methodical manner. I'd like to start off today starting on some of the background of really how did AFT get into this conversation. I've given a few of these talks before, and it's one of the questions that I've gotten quite a bit, like, why is AFT in this space? We are a farmland protection organization, and that is above all else, the main part of our mission. But the other part of our mission is that we are trying to protect the land, the farmers, and they're also trying to promote the practices that are sound and going to move us into a secure food future. So solar siting hits on all three of those, and AFT, starting in 2017, has engaged with people in New England trying to understand where do all of those three parts of the AFT mission interact with solar? How can AFT support this types of siting policies and programs that can actually benefit the people that we work with here? And so in 2017, there was an initial meeting in Connecticut. Some of you on may have heard about it or may have attended, really just sort of initially discussing some of these issues. And from that initial meeting came the Smart Solar Siting Partnership for New England. So the next steps will sort of, move through that down the road, but we've really been in this space for about 3 years, and we've been deeply engaged more and more as we move forward. Go ahead and move to the next one, Megan. So a little bit about the background and the theory of where we sit in terms of this conversation. If we look at this spectrum, like, solar light, playing with the spectrum of colors of light here, down in the blue end, or I guess up in the blue end for you guys in the picture, that's status quo if we just protect farmland and we do not develop any solar on it. And there's an asterisk, and I'm gonna get to that in a moment. Down on the other far end of the spectrum, we have farmland loss when we just open the doors and we say, we need solar energy, let's not stop it, let's just develop what we need in solar energy. We see incredible amounts of farmland loss if that were the direction we would move in. But back to the status quo, if we are only protecting farmland and we are not engaging and advancing smart solar siting, we're going to lose farmland anyway. We're either going to lose farmland to low density residential development, urban development. We're going to lose farmland due to degradation and climate change. So with no action or with wide open doors for solar siting, there's incredible potential for farmland loss. However, if we can find a reasoned and stepwise and well-vetted manner of siting solar within farmland and other important natural and working lands, we can actually move forward where we save farmland and we can meet our clean energy development goals. And that's really why AFT's been at the table in this conversation, is to really push this conversation to the middle. How do we do this where we can support both ends of the spectrum and move forward in the best direction? Next slide, please. So part of the reasoning behind this, which I've explained a little bit, is that we're trying to maximize the renewable energy potential while minimizing the impact on our most productive farmland. We're not, as an organization, we are not blanket against solar on farmland. Absolutely not. We are for protecting our most productive farmland. And that does not preclude solar siting. So we see this as an opportunity for farmers and landowners to engage in solar siting in such a way that it supports their farm, increase farm viability, diversify your income stream. However, we support a very well thought out placement of that solar on farmland. And there are a few different ways that we can do that. And there are a lot of guides out there that are available. In fact, Alex was the author of one of the guides that for the state of Vermont about farm-friendly solar, and that's something that will be available to you on the resource page. But there are projects out there right now, and later you're going to hear from Jake Marley, there are projects out there right now that can actually show us how we integrate solar and farmland together in such a way where we can move both forward together. Next one, please. So we've developed some in-house guidelines when we're thinking about how do we move this conversation forward so that we can prioritize our land, we can prioritize protecting agriculture, and we can prioritize our farmers' needs. And so we think about this in those three legs when we talk about solar siting guidelines for farmland. And so if we're prioritizing land, you're trying to guide your siting first to disturbed or marginal farmland. Marginal is a vague term that has a lot of definitions depending on who you ask. For us, it means the fields, the portions of a farmer's lands that are not productive, they're rocky, they're too clay, or perhaps it's sort of the back 40, right, the wasteland where all the old farm equipment is, really trying to take advantage of spaces that are not the most productive on your farm. We also want to prioritize agriculture, so that means protecting farmland so we can continue to have agriculture into the future. And so part of that is also siting, but part of that is also trying to push incentives across states where we can prioritize disturbed and preferred sites such as rooftops or contaminated lands and things like that. And prioritize farmers. If you are going to be, if we're going to encourage siting of solar on farmland, we need to make sure that we are working with the farmers. They have to be a part of the conversation, whether it is a traditional ground mount solar on their disturbed or on their wasteland or their marginal land, or if it's dual use, which you'll hear more about today. They absolutely need to be part of this conversation. Go ahead, Megan. So when we're talking about prioritizing agriculture, we're talking about prioritizing development on those state preferred sightings locations, and it's different state to state. Brownfields, rooftops, building mount, solar canopies, all of those are excellent choices for solar, but many reports and lots of research have shown that in New England, we do not have enough of that land and space, and financially, it's difficult to always site solar on those preferred sites. So there will be greenfield solar. It is not something we can blanket keep off. We can't keep off the grass with solar here. So we have to think about prioritizing those, but also making sure that we are moving in a smart direction with our greenfield solar. Secondly, avoid siting on our most productive land. The key point here is we do not want to displace agriculture from the land. And that is our most important point as AFT as an organization. Farming must continue on a farmer's land. And then we also want to incentivize dual use. And just a really quick definition of dual use, if anyone's unfamiliar with the term, it's also called agrivoltaics. Sometimes it's called co-location, but it is, if we have 1 acre, let's say we have a 1 acre field, it is actually siting usually raised ground mount solar in such a way where it's spaced far apart enough between the rows that you can actually continue to farm the land between the rows. And it's installed in such a way that it's minimally disturbing to the soil and to the lands. There's no big concrete footings. You're not removing any of the topsoil. You're really doing your best to keep everything in place. And you then have to adjust your farming, but farming can continue. Next one, please. Prioritizing land. So state by state, the land priorities are a little bit different. So we always want to protect prime farmland because we know that that is typically the most productive. AFT also has our PVR land, and so we are trying to determine how can we put together some policies about using our PVR scores for land to actually designate more appropriate places to site where there's a lower PVR value and protect our higher PVR lands. If it's actively farmed and it's unique, or if it's farmland of statewide importance, we want those to be dual use if possible. We don't want to lose any of these important lands. We don't want to lose prime land whatsoever. We prefer if solar could go anywhere else, but if a farmer has a lot of prime soil and this is going to help them be viable, then let's move it forward in a smart way, like dual use, where that prime soil can still be productive, can still be producing. Next. And then lastly, prioritizing farmers. Projects that are going to be developed for the farmer to farm around. If the farmer's not involved in the conversation, how do you know it's going to be built to the right specifications where equipment or irrigation systems can actually be implemented and accessed around this panel? So they have to be there and they have to be a part of the conversation. The agriculture really needs to be prioritized. It's not going to be a solar array first and then farmland second. We have to make sure that the agricultural production is part of the development process and the structure is flexible enough to allow agriculture to continue in different manners in the future. Maybe it's grazing now, but maybe one day it'll be pumpkins or squash. So we really want to make sure that there is enough flexibility in the structure of solar that the farmer has flexibility in their future plans, because we know farming changes. Next, please. So those are our in-house guidelines, and those are available to you. But I want to talk more briefly about the New England Smart Solar Siting Partnership that came out of this initial conversation from 2017. This is a joint venture. AFT is leading, but we work very closely with Acadia Center, with Vermont Law School's Farm Energy Initiative, with Conservation Law Foundation, and with Boat Solar. And we've been working together for 2 years, and we are wrapping up to the point where we are culminating all of our research and all of our analyses and all of our project hours into some webinars coming up that I'll talk about more later. But we've been working very hard on what is this concept of smart solar siting. We've been working with interviewing stakeholders from all areas, from all of the New England states, trying to establish state-by-state priorities, state-by-state policies that are working, where improvements need to be made, trying to understand values from different stakeholders. And putting these together into really a set of policies and program suggestions and some guidelines to help build those policies and programs that will actually reduce conflict in siting across the states. And so smart solar siting to us in this project is really a process that removes unnecessary barriers to solar projects that are in the public interest, while providing key and careful oversight for projects that do have impacts on communities and on our natural resources. It's not a full stop, no solar here. It's a, if this is going to cause conflict, let's make sure we go through this process with all of the stakeholders at the table, and that we work through our values and we gauge the best end result possible. Next one, please. And I'm going to pause here, and this is really what we're culminating in starting the 3rd week of September, 4th week of September. On the 23rd, we're going to start sharing a lot of our hard work from this project, including guiding principles for solar energy development in New England. We've developed state-specific land use scenarios based upon projected energy needs and current land availability for state to state. We have policy comparisons across New England. We've developed policy strategies. We've looked at farm and forest solar land use scenarios. How can we utilize some of these lands in the least impactful way? And then how can we meet our energy needs on contaminated lands? We've looked at solar costs, especially for alternative types of siting. And then we've also, pardon the typo at the bottom there, examples of dual use solar projects, so people can get a better understanding of what that really looks like. So, you know, there'll be a link at the end. We hope that you join us for these upcoming webinars, but that's really where AFT is sitting, and this is what we've been doing for a couple of years, and we're excited to be able to share out. So I've talked enough. I'm gonna take a pause and introduce our next poll, which is thinking about what sort of issues or even actions have you been seeing in the communities that you're in around solar siting and farmland? Seeing loss of prime farmland? Are you seeing farmers being approached by solar developers, farmers seeking resources? Are you seeing communities proactively planning for solar, which is something we hope to see more often? And another thing that's maybe not on there, are you seeing that, do you have a lack of adequate policies that incentivize solar? Or are you seeing something else? So if you're seeing something else, please let us know what it is so that we have a better idea of what we need to help with as much as we can. Take a moment and answer those. Okay. It looks like it's a large portion of you are seeing farmers being approached by solar developers and farmers seeking resources. And I am very happy to see that you are experiencing or seeing communities proactively planning for solar siting. That is the best way to get ahead of this so that you can really implement some smart solar siting. And in the chat, thank you, Lindsay, the community support of solar, but the NIMBY, yes, we see a lot of that, not in my backyard. That's an issue that we see. And so one way that we hope to be able to tackle that issue is finding ways to site it where it's least impactful for your neighbors as part of the smart siting practice. Nobody wants to see fields gone. Nobody wants their view interrupted. But we do know that we need solar. So that is an issue that has to be sort of forged ahead and try to find a common ground with that. Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to take a breath and move on, and we're going to pass it over to Alex Pilis from the Vermont Agency of Ag, Food, and Markets. And Alex has been working in clean energy projects and public service since 1993. Is that right, Alex? You're up next. And so we're gonna hear from him and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a note on that poll, what you splashed on the screen was correct, but then the poll that came up did not have that entry lack of policies. So I would have voted for lack of policies, but it wasn't available on the actual poll. So anyhow, yeah, I see a lot of NIMBY stuff, you know, among other things, like Lindsay said. So anyhow, thank you. This has been interesting, and I'll set my timer here. Ready, set, go. All right, I'm ready. This is a picture of a wide-spaced solar array in Bristol, Vermont. I'm going to use it for my Zoom background after I get out of this phone call because I think it's really cool. Anyhow, keep going. I'll explain more. So I'm not a land use person. I came at this through engineering and project development and then got into the regulatory stuff on solar. But as I understand Vermont, since coming here, there's 3 types of land use. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about energy siting, how we actually look at these projects from the farmland protection perspective, and give an example of a project. So the first big bucket of land use or type of land use in Vermont is development. It's defined, it's above a certain size of acres or houses. I don't really work in this area, but there's a statewide land use law, Act 250. If you take farmland, if you destroy farmland through development, it must be mitigated through conservation and use for use as farming. Has to be available for farming, conserved in perpetuity. You can do on-site, you can do off-site. Off-site carries an acreage multiplier depending on the type of soil that you're destroying. What kind of soil are you taking out of production? Next. So yeah, that's Act 250. Yep. And then the other land use is, another land use is traditional. So farming and forestry. Farming finds its definition in the development law, and it is not development. That's how it's defined. Farming is not development. And by the way, it's this. A bunch of activities are listed, and it has to be principally produced on the farm. So and our land use laws on farming, you know, itself, the regulations on farming are mainly around water quality. So that's how traditional land use works. I don't get into forestry, but that's how farming is handled. Energy is handled through a statewide siting law called Section 248. It is a weighing of public good, as you would have in most statewide energy siting statutes. Is it in the public good to build this facility? And there are utility system criteria about is it economic? Is it going to cause disruption on the transmission system? Those kinds of things. And there's a bunch of environmental criteria which are borrowed from Act 250, including more recently, farmland specifically. That came into the law about 3 years ago. So now our agency has a hook. We actually can look at these projects and say, okay, maybe not such a great project in terms of farmland. Please do this, that, or the other. Okay, go ahead. So our criterion in farmland is no undue adverse impact on farmland. And we look at both NRCS map farmland and de facto farmland. And that's de facto is historical use. It's in use as farming. It's been farmed for a while. Even if it's not on the NRCS map as prime ag, it is farmland. So when we, and here's the document people from Vermont look at for how we define our farmland. You can use the web soil survey from NRCS to find the farmland rating, but this is a specific Vermont system. In any case, NRCS farmland mapped, NRCS prime ag is mapped on our online atlas. So it's easy to find. And when the projects come in, I'll show you this, they tell us this is where the prime ag is, the primary agricultural soils as defined in Vermont statute. Go ahead. So, and then there's de facto farmland. Now this, I don't know if there's any pointer, but if you look on this, the diagonal crosshatch there is NRCS mapped soil. So, but up in the top edge there is the solar project on top of some land that is not NRCS mapped. If you look at the aerial view of this, you can see it's totally been farmland for years and years, going back to 2003. So that little lobe up there at the top is de facto farmland. There's another lobe like this at the bottom. But another thing to look at in this project, which you're looking at about 30 acres there, is how it's weirdly tucked in. There's like a river on the left, there's a power line going north-south, there's a road on the right, and there's like 4 kinds of soils. So these projects actually on not that big a piece of land get really complicated. There's a lot of weird constraints. There's a little stream flowing through this one. So that's, you know, a case of like why I have to look at these to figure out what the heck is going on and where is there really farmland. Go ahead. So best practices, complete and bankruptcy remote decommissioning. I also want to, can I just jump to my screen for a second? I want to show people something that I think is that possible, Jamie? No, okay. So one best practice is to pay depending on whether it's on a previously impacted site or not, right? Ground mounted solar, it's just like what they do, you know, give more money for farming friendly arrays and less money if it's just on a green field and no provision for farming. So we do that in Vermont. We have differential rates depending on what kind of land it's on. Anyhow, that's a best practice. Bankruptcy remote decommissioning required. Remove soil by layers and stockpile it. We have a whole guideline for this. Replace, put them back the way you found them in the same order. We have a provision on wet ground. We almost never allow grading because it's almost impossible to put the soil back in the layers you took it out. If there's trees, we try to only allow stump removal inside the fence. Shake the stumps over the hole, geotextile under the road so you can take the road the hell out. And, you know, in larger projects, we ask them to pre-test for compaction and then to remediate at the end. Go ahead. This is just an example of a project, and you can see how I sketched it up there. So the yellow are the boundaries of different types of NRCS mapped soils. The orange, I identified where the stockpiles were supposed to be. I noticed there was a bunch of tree cutting over on the western edge there. And then I also noticed there was some farmland that was not NRCS mapped. I saw this weird perimeter of cross-hatching. You know, the testimony said there was a berm. I'm like, no, I don't see any berm cross-section. Is there really a berm? No, there's not actually a berm. So, you know, I look at these plans and I try to figure out what the heck's going on and make sure that the project can be taken out and the land put back to farming. That is the ultimate goal here. And it gets into a lot of detail, but that's the bottom line. And I think I'm done with my 8 minutes. 1 second, done. Okay, there's my timer. Anything else here? I think I maybe have one more slide. No, I think I'm done. Tyler. Oh,
Thank you,
I want,
Alex.
I want to mention one more thing.
Sure.
That guide on farming friendly solar was actually written by Kimberly Hagan. She's on this call, so I want to make sure that we just give her the credit for that. I helped her edit it, but it's been fun to work with her. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And we will have an opportunity for questions for both Alex and Tyler together after Tyler has a chance. And so I will take a moment to welcome you all to listen to Tyler Miller. He's the Vermont Land Trust Vice President of Stewardship, and we are happy to have him here today to talk more about conservation, conserved land, solar compatibility, and maybe some bumps in the road. Thank you, Tyler. Take it away.
Great, thanks. Happy to be here. Yeah, so I'm just gonna kind of jump in where Alex left off and just take us down one more level into conserved land in particular. So sort of like everything Alex just described is completely relevant to conserved land, and then there's a few more things that would sort of get added on, particularly the conservation easement restrictions, the particulars of those. And so I wanted to kind of walk us through just like the approval process. So we're, as a land trust, we're really less involved in sort of like state level solar policy and more involved in the vetting of individual projects and requests on specific parcels of farmland. But just really quick, sort of why we went through a policy development process with our primary farmland conservation partners, Vermont Housing Conservation Board and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. A really great, thorough process resulted in a policy that's been really effective for us. And I think at a high level, that policy sort of says that there's a role for solar on conserved farmland. Like programmatically, it's important. It's important for individual farms. Many of the things Emily was describing earlier just are relevant for us at a programmatic level. And then with that, we want to be incredibly mindful of the scale, the location, and the sort of impact, positive and negative, on individual farms, individual parcels, and how that intersects with the conservation easement. So that was kind of a big lift early on that's allowed us to be relatively efficient in sort of addressing the particulars that come up on a project by project basis. And really the reason for that was this kind of intersection of public policy. So as Vermont started to get very clear about its renewable energy goals and what it's going to take to achieve that, really seeing, you can't achieve this by like not being active on farmland. And for conserved land, there are about 1,000 conserved farms in Vermont now. So it's a sort of a big part of the overall farmland mix. And so in order to achieve those goals and the goals that VLT developed for ourselves around how the organization wants to respond to climate change, it felt important to be able to be active here and be sort of part of that solution. And then really there's a piece around the underpinnings of the farmland conservation program itself. And, really this dual purpose of conserving and protecting important agricultural and other natural resources on the landscape and promoting active and economically viable agriculture. And so those two stand together. It was sort of equal footing. There's some inherent and interesting conflicts that can arise, but really it's sort of signaling conserving land is important and critical, and also farmers are going to need to have infrastructure and make development and make changes, and things are going to be really active on these parcels. So in a way, solar fits really well into that. There, I think as the solar industry grew in Vermont and started to mature, really seeing real opportunities for farmers to, create fundamentally more sustainable farm operations, both sort of financially and from a natural resource perspective, and also really just sort of have ways to be a little more self-sufficient, a little more energy security, and perhaps increase, financial returns. So a nice way to enhance the conservation easement purposes, while also just being really mindful about, these smart solar siting guidelines, which are very similar to what AFT is describing, are reflected in our policy. So that's kind of the why, and the how. Really, it picks up where and kind of happens in parallel with the state 248 process. And that's a really robust process that we rely on for many of the things Alex was describing are all incredibly helpful. It's great for us as a land trust not to have to, start from scratch, knowing that there's going to be a series of really excellent benchmarks that will be met on any solar project, conserved land or otherwise. Where we jump off maybe from that, I sort of laid out this like sort of decision tree in this slide, just picking on 3 kind of basic questions that kind of guide us toward, is this going to be a relatively simple and straightforward approval, to is this one of the more complex approvals that may or may not get to the finish line on conserved land, or might have to have, additional conditions and considerations. So the first is just, where is it going to be located? Is it co-located on farm infrastructure or ground mounted? Probably somewhat obviously our strong preference is to locate it on existing buildings when possible. Really mitigates any meaningful resource impact. Ground mounted opens up the second level sort of decisions and questions around location on ag soils, around sensitive wet areas, and a whole host of questions that come under that. The second is the array going to be scaled to the farm's energy usage and consumption? And this is really or is it going to be sort of separate from that, or many factors beyond that? This is really a question of scale, really scale as a proxy for impact, particularly on ground mounted arrays. So the sweet spot for us is a system that is largely designed to offset the farm or the overall operations energy consumption. And that creates a pretty tight connection to the easement purposes and the sort of specific reserve rights that exist in most of our easements. And the last question is the array going to be owned by the farm or owned by a third party? And that's really a question around the sort of legal underpinnings of the arrangement that would exist if it's owned by a third party. If it's owned by a farm, then it starts to reflect much more like a typical piece of farm infrastructure, another barn or a manure pit or an outdoor wood boiling furnace. If it's a third party, then there's going to be often a long-term lease on a specified area, or perhaps a term easement with particular rights reserved for the third party. And then there's just a process we go through to make sure that those legal requirements are not in conflict with the requirements like the conservation easement. So depending on how we answer these questions, it can be kind of a quick and easy approval process or a more complicated one. Obviously, the easiest being co-located on a piece of farm infrastructure that's scaled to the farm's operation, and that's owned by the farm. That's virtually a rubber stamp on conserved land. And the opposite, right, would be maybe the hardest and the most complex for us to get our head around relative to the conservation easement restrictions. So sited on farmland directly, not scaled to the farm's operation, or many times larger than the farm's operational need, and owned by a third party. We can work with that example and sometimes, ultimately approve it, but like it's going to be the more complicated version. So we can go to the next slide. Just have a couple of examples to share. The first is that sort of easy example. So this is obviously an array, a pretty large array actually, on about 150 kilowatts on a farm in Randolph, Vermont. So it hits those sort of easy criteria, right? Co-located on an existing barn, scaled to the operation's energy needs. It's a pretty energy intensive operation and owned by the farm. So this was, despite its significant size, pretty easy. And the kind of thing we want to promote wherever possible. We can't require certainly that things are located on barns, and many of the barns in Vermont aren't up to the task of carrying that load, or their orientation isn't south facing enough, et cetera. But when it's possible, it can be really great fit. So this is in a complex area where development is already contemplated for agricultural uses under the easement. So it's a great and easy fit. Go to the next one. This one was a little more complicated. So this is the inverse. This is one that is located on the ground, is scaled quite a bit larger than the farm's operational energy needs, and is owned by a third party. But we were also able to approve this one. And the real main reason for that, you can sort of see, this is the farmer and the solar developer worked really well together to create a dual use project that was extremely compatible with the farm's operational needs. So essentially, this is a large scale livestock operation. It actually has a slaughterhouse and processing facility. So a lot of cattle move through this farm, and they had a real need for a greatly enhanced barnyard and winter turnout area sort of exploring options. Probably needed some coverage, get cattle out of the worst of weather, get them some shade. Started working with a solar developer to come up with this pretty innovative approach of a significantly sized solar array, about 4 acres or so, that would be reinforced, lifted up, and allow for cattle to graze and turn out in the winter under the panels. So, so this one really, I think, was, for my experience, the best example of a dual use that I've seen, and really, I think in terms of like compatibility with the conservation easement, really made a clear and articulate case for why this really furthers the purposes of the easement, the farm's goals, and the long-term viability of this farm's operation. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you. Thanks to both Tyler and Alex for that. We have a few moments now where we would like to open this up to some Q&A for those of you on the workshop with us today. If you have a question that you would like to ask, feel free to just pop it right into the chat, and then as those scroll up, we can farm those out to Tyler and Alex for their answer. Sorry, full of puns. So there's a good one I see already from Tim Upton. So I think this could probably be for both of you. How will solar projects, especially ground mounted, affect UVA status? Could it be different for dual use projects or for projects with defined lifespan and decommissioning plan? Tyler, Alex, want to take that one?
Tyler, I've heard this question before, so I can start answering it, at least from the agency's perspective.
Perfect.
So use value appraisal has been looked at for solar, and it sort of came down to the farmer had to be more than half the off-taker, as that could be a use value project on equipment. So the law is not that helpful here. Could it be different? Yes, if you change the law. Could you enforce it that the actual activity is taking place underneath? Or are you going to assume that because you built it so much more expensively higher off the ground, that the activity must be taking place, or you will give it use value appraisal as a farm structure? You know, it's not easy. It could be done. It would need to be brought forward as a statute change, not just an interpretation, because they've already looked at solar for use value appraisal, and they've already interpreted the law and made a decision as to what kind of solar falls under current use or use value appraisal. So interesting ideas, Tim, and glad to discuss them with you. Been in those discussions with other developers, and was interrupted by COVID-19. So it's an interesting discussion.
Tyler, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that sums it up. At this point, if you're not offsetting your farm's power, it's coming out of current use. I think that's the law.
I just want to take a quick moment to recognize that we also have Matthew Burke on the line, who is postdoc. Is that correct, Matthew? With the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, part of the Gund Institute at UVM. He is also an expert on some solar siting and some best management practices and how to move this forward. So if there's an appropriate question, he's welcome to jump in if he's available. And the next question I see is from Lindsay Burke saying, Alex, not sure if I misheard, but is the end goal to get the land back into farming and remediate the land after the solar panels come off? And when would that be?
So end goal, well, the requirement is that the thing has to be decommissioned. That's in law, or rule, actually, administrative rule. So whether it's a goal or not doesn't matter. It's the law. So that's the way that works. And yes, it has to be decommissioned and returned as close as possible to the original condition. And this happens whenever the project is not operating anymore. And that's yeah, that, ceasing operation. Now, people say, oh, well, we'll develop it, and so on and so forth. We'll put houses there, maybe, but if you do, then you would still have to decommission it and probably return it to the original condition before you put up houses, unless you could get some kind of an amendment to the whole certificate of public good. And I'm not sure how that would work. We run into this same problem of, never mind, I don't want to get into too many details. We have limited time, but we can talk about it offline if you're interested.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I do know that other places regionally, more and more are requiring decommissioning projects, and perhaps the town would have right of first refusal before things could change hands after the panels are removed. But a lifespan might be 25, 30 years for typical panels. So it would be quite a while, but there could be a lot of rehab that happens during those 25, 30 years for those lands. Next question, I think we have time for a few more from Megan Fowler. I'm interested in how much money farmers can save on energy costs when the solar is scaled to cover the farm's energy use. Do you have any metrics or sort of any examples that might help our attendees today, Tyler or Alex?
My impression, yeah, go ahead, Tyler. I haven't actually looked at it too much from the farmer's perspective. I looked at it a couple times. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say similarly. I mean, I think a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but typically the payback period is far shorter than the operational lifespan. So that larger array I put up, I think the estimate was a 14-year. I'm sorry, the first array, the one on the roof, it's like a 14-year payback on a set of panels that are guaranteed for 25 years and likely to go longer. So sort of one way of thinking of, like, barring maintenance costs, is to have free energy after 14 years. That I think is like somewhat typical. It really depends on the finances and sort of what everything costs along the way. But that's sort of in the ballpark of what I've heard. So it's meaningful.
Yeah, it is meaningful. And I guess I'll put it another way. When obviously you're gonna have to take out a loan to do this. And then the question is, do you have positive cash flow? And, starting when do you have positive cash flow? So that actually, in some cases, is from day one. So not a lot of cash flow, but you're still in the black instead of in the red, even with the paying off the debt. So that's a good scenario. I think that's often the case. Sometimes it takes a few years before you get there.
And I think that's something we can also, this topic we can ask Jake after his, because he's going to talk some of the financials as well.
Great.
I think we have time for one quick question before we can move on. And those of you that haven't had your questions answered, if we have time at the end, we will open it back up for broad Q&A. And if not, we will do our best to answer you after this offline. But the last one from Kimberly Hagan, welcome, is, does anyone have data on how many solar projects are farm owned? And those that are not, what's the typical financial return to the farmer? I think we'll talk about the second part with Jake Marley, but any idea how many of these are farm owned?
Yeah, I could only speak to the conserve ones that show up on conserved land. That's really wax and wane with industry standards and tax incentives. So there was an era where most of them were, so I think it started out farmer owned, and there was an era of third party owned, and now I think we're largely back in the era of farmer owned. And I think that really is driven by tax appetite and how you put together financing. So I'd say a majority on the conserve side, a majority are farmer owned.
I'm not seeing that. My impression is that it's not so much farmer owned. A lot of that, and that's maybe because I hear about dairy farmers so much and they have such a large energy appetite. So it seems like a great place to put it, but they don't have any income, and therefore they don't have any tax appetite, and therefore they don't own them. So that's part of what I'm seeing. And financial return to the farmer for use of land in a third party situation. I do have some leases that I got a hold of, or some agreements or leases, I think, that I got a hold of when, I don't remember why I got these, but it was a pretty good lease rate, on the order of whatever, $5,000 an acre. So, those are pretty big numbers. Anyhow, that's, of course you'd have to pay to take it out of current use. in some cases too. So that's another big cost. I'm sorry, I don't have good data. I can send those leases if you're interested. It's public information.
I can tell you across New England, I can't find good data on that. So it's, it's not just you. One quick question from Jeannie Bartlett. Would Alex or Tyler be good people to refer farmers to if they're approached by a developer?
I would be glad to hear from people. I don't have a good guidance. It's, I've considered doing it. I'm not sure there's a lot of need. I haven't had a lot of questions on it. So I'm reluctant to sort of put together one of these toolkits or whatever without having seen a real demand for it. But it sounds like, Jeannie, you see this kind of stuff in forestry, and maybe there is a need for it. So I'm sort of two minds about it. I don't have something I'm considering now that you're asking doing it. So any other thoughts on that, Jeannie?
We'll give her a second to respond. I would also just point in there that Farmland Information Center, so farmlandinfo.org, we've started a repository of quite a bit of solar siting resources across the nation. And there are some farmer-focused documents in there that might be from other states, but are still particularly helpful in this case, no matter the state. And Jeannie just mentions, she just wanted to share it out if we're available. So we'll share all of the resources that we can find on those topics with everybody. Thank you all. If we didn't get to your question, we will try to tackle it at the end of this, or certainly answer it offline. But I'd like to transition over to Jake Marley. We asked Jake to be on all of 3 of our webinars this week. So to alleviate the, the stress on him, he has actually pre-recorded a short presentation that we'll show, and then he'll be on and will be available for Q&A after that. But Jake is the managing director of Hyperion Systems, and they focus mostly on agrivoltaic solutions, and they are also responsible for putting the first agrivoltaic array in the US at the UMass Research Farm. So thanks for being here, Jake. We're going to watch your presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after.
Hi, my name is Jake Marley. I'm the Managing Director of Hyperion Systems. I want to first start by thanking American Farmland Trust for this opportunity to present today on dual-use solar. And Dr. Michael Lehan, also from Hyperion, will be presenting with me as well. Hyperion Systems was started in 2009 with the belief of food first, then energy. At the core of this hypothetical proposition was that there's a more efficient way to use land than converting it strictly to energy generation, taking it out of agricultural production. This hypothesis was cast if the solar modules are designed specifically to meet the farm's needs, a parcel of land could be used for both energy generation and food production. Hyperion has been funded by NREL as a research partner on the INSPIRE project since 2016. NREL, which stands for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, is a DOE agency which is focused on renewable energy optimization systems. The INSPIRE project, its principal investigator is Jordan Machnick. Hyperion's role within the INSPIRE research effort has been multifaceted, primarily focusing on dual-use economic development, physical project development, and concept dissemination. There are currently 20 different project sites, as you can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner. Other markets are also considering dual-use development, primarily Europe and Asia. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy are building larger scale, community scale solar projects, as well as in Asia, China, and Japan, building community shared or utility scale dual use solar projects. And now we'll transition to Dr. Michael Lehan to take a closer look at the economic tool that Hyperion has created for the INSPIRE project.
Thank you for the introduction, Jake. This is a snapshot of a segment of the model that Hyperion created with NREL support The intent of the model is to show a farmer all of the information that they need in one place to make a decision about a long-term capital investment. This example is a 250 kW system. The farmer owns it, and they get smart incentives. Now let's look at the full spreadsheet so that you can see how complete and how thorough and what the overview is. Here's a snapshot of, I will just quickly scroll through the full model so that you can see what the intent, what the scope, and how useful it is, the depth, and the completeness. The original intent was to compare farmland with no solar, with a traditional solar array, and with a dual use or co-location solar array. We then added in tax efficient and tax inefficient. The farmer may or may not care about that, but the capital markets who are funding this do care about it. So at the end of the day, the farmer does care about it. This is the overview of a comparison of the various scenarios. And if you look at scenario B, you can see that the total benefits in terms of cash flow are greater than the other benefits for a variety. You're basically getting an electricity crop, and you're getting a slightly diminished agricultural crop at the same time. So this is the top of it. There are, and why won't you move? There's a graphic representation of it. Here are the assumptions and the data entry. The colored cells you enter data in, the rest are calculated, and it shows all of the capital costs so that the farmer can deal effectively with the developer, with the installer, with the financer. All of the information is there. And then finally, what we come down to is some cost-benefit analysis, which compares the revenue streams for the next 20 years. So here is everything in about 8 lines, and if they want further details, they'll go back to the larger models that we just showed you. Now I'm going to hand it back to Jake. He can talk about the impacts and the full effects of this very important work that we're doing for NREL and for farmers.
So now that we've gone through some of the economic theory, I wanted to get into the reality and what our experience has been with meeting with several different farmers, different types of producers in Massachusetts and in the Northeast region. Of course, all farmers are different and require unique solutions, but in general, farmers are more likely to invest in operating costs that will produce or increase their revenues rather than investing in new infrastructure. This leads quickly to the discussion or conversation about project costs and what is the best use of capital. Do I want to borrow funds, or is there another type of project ownership that will be better suited for the farmer? And in our experience, they're more likely to look into leasing or a power purchasing agreement rather than owning it outright, and would rather, again, use those revenues to invest back into the farming operation. So you might be asking yourself, what does this project development process look like compared to traditionally installed solar? Hyperion has been working with a Western Mass farmer in Amherst for about the last 8 months to develop a dual-use array on his field that currently produces squash. This field is subject to conservation, which is APR, Agricultural Preservation Restriction, and that is enforced by the Mass Department of Ag Resources. This particular grower is a third-generation steward of the land. He's an industry leader and innovator, which is part of the reason we approached him. The dual-use project development process differs from traditional installation process. We'll walk through the dual use first and then the traditional. The dual use starts with a predetermination application in order to qualify for that 6-cent adder that we had talked about. So Clean Energy Extension reviews that predetermination application first. They confer with Mass Department of Ag Resources, and then there's actually an on-site meeting between the developer, the farmer, and Mass Department of Ag Resources and Clean Energy Extension to go through that predetermination application. And the biggest point of that application is a farm plan, a long-term farm plan for this land, and then also a secondary and potentially a tertiary farm plan in order to have something in place in case the first farm plan falls through, given the variable of the shade provided by the panels, the solar modules. In the traditional project development process would be just to submit an ISA after securing the land with the landowner. So that interconnection service agreement and under the traditional development process would be submitted right away after a project size has been determined, and the ASTGU, the predetermination application process happens before that interconnection service agreement, and that predetermination application we found takes about 3 to 4 months. So that's something that we'll get into on the next slide as well. This is more timely, this dual use, and there is more planning and thinking ahead. So as I was just mentioning, the timeline is a key takeaway that for developers and for landowners, because this farmer has been very generous with his time in developing this project. He's viewing this long-term, that this is a really truly innovative project and can be pioneering for not just chicken production, but for other farmers in the Western Mass area. That timeline with the predetermination application, again, increases the overall project development by about 3 or 4 months. There is room to work for solar development. As we mentioned, this land is subject to conservation, and of course that's the focus of this webinar series. There are limitations to behind the meter limitations, and then also impervious surface of the overall land. So we've had to work within those, but are in the process of doing that with Mass Department of Ag Resources and Clean Energy Extension. And then the other key takeaway is the dual use adder allows for additional benefits to directly help the farmer. Some of those would be for the chicken production. We're enhancing the fencing security around the array. There will be a water delivery system that's free to the farmer, and then also an increased per acre lease payment. And of course, that's a revenue diversification for the farmer, which is really key in an inherently risky business, as we've seen, especially this year. Thank you for your attention to our presentation. Thank you again to American Farmland Trust for the opportunity to present what we've been working on and our findings thus far. And we would be happy to follow up. You can see our contact information below. Thank you.
Great. So we have time now for Q&A. And I think we can actually just go back to a couple of the questions that were originally posted after Tyler and Alex's presentation to address those first. And then everyone else, if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat and we'll get them over to Jake. So the first question that we had prior that seems like it's best aligned here is, let's see, what is the typical financial return to farmers for the use of land for solar development? And the related one is the one prior to that. Let me find it. Pardon me while I look for it. Oh, the other one from how much money farmers can save on energy costs when it's scaled to the farm energy use. So thanks for being with us, Jake. If you want to tackle one of those, and then we can move forward.
Absolutely. So it's important to consider the 3 different ownership structures. Owning it outright, leasing, or a power purchasing agreement. Leasing is the easiest to tackle in terms of what the payback is, and that's on a as Alex mentioned, that's on a per acre basis generally, or a per capacity. So say it's a megawatt project, they'll get a flat annual payment. And for an acre scale, let's say in Massachusetts, it's about $2,500 per acre, but of course that depends on a number of factors, location being the primary one. A power purchasing agreement, so that's a nuanced difference than the leasing option. and the power purchasing agreement. So a third party does own the project, and the power is being utilized by the farm. And typically under that, the farmer is looking to get a percentage decrease off of what their current utility bill is, and that is locked in for a specified period of time. And so a good PPA rate might be 15 to 20%. So if you have an 18 cent kilowatt hour utility rate, 3 cents, or it's about 3 or 4 cents off of that would be the 20% power purchasing agreement rate. And then if they're owning the project outright, that's sort of difficult, but typical payback without any loans would be about 7 or 8 years. And then moving forward, they're getting free energy, right? That's their upfront investment paid off, and then everything moving forward is it is a positive return from them. For third-party investors, the typical kind of return that they're looking for is about a 10% internal rate of return. So that's a figure to keep in mind as just a barometer, a good metric to have. Owning the system, you'll, as the owner outright, it is about right around that 10%. Could be a little bit lower or potentially higher, depending on the incentives, of course.
Jake, I have a question a little bit about scale. So maybe you could use one of the projects in your portfolio for as an example, but what might be a typical amount of electricity produced on one of the smaller dual use arrays, and do you have an idea of what that really relates to in terms of monthly financials for the farmer if they own it?
Yes. So a smaller farm, they might be considering something in a 25 to 100 kW system. And if they're owning that outright, I suppose they're looking at savings in the 5 figures, tens of thousands of dollars of what their utility bills might be. Of course, that is after the break-even point moving forward. So there is that upfront cost. Yeah. I'm sorry, I lost part of the second half of that question, Emily.
So what might be the monthly, I guess, is there a monthly electricity cost comparison?
Yes. It definitely depends on what the type of farm is. So if it's a dairy was one of the examples, they have a lot of behind the meter energy usage. Some of the farms, some of the dairies that we've worked with in the past, they're especially in the warm summer months, their refrigeration usage goes way up. So they're looking at, yes, monthly bills of $10,000 to $15,000, even for medium-sized dairies.
Wow.
And so the 100 or 150 kilowatt system is something that is potentially about 100% behind the meter to cover the full 100% behind the meter usage.
And so 100 kW, 150 kW, if that is standard ground mount, about what size footprint would that have?
Yes, so that's a great point. A standard 100 kW system might be about 1/2 of an acre. And for dual use, because you're spreading the modules out, increasing the amount of sunlight reaching the ground below, it's not quite a doubling figure, but about 75% or 50% more land. So perhaps a full acre for that 100 or 150 kW system.
Wow, that's great. So the size impact of at least for on-farm scale is minimal compared to some of these larger arrays that people seem to be far more concerned about.
Yes, absolutely. And Alex was really hitting on that in terms of the sort of conserved farmland projects. It's limited to the behind the meter usage. So those project scales, especially if it's a produce farm, they're not having a lot of behind the meter usage. They're a smaller project. Once it moves outside of the conserved easements or restrictions in place, that's where the larger projects are really seen going on farmland.
Great, thank you. One question we had was maybe understanding a little more about how the adder incentivizes these types of projects in Massachusetts, and if you see that as being something that is working, and maybe something that other states like Vermont could model in the future if they adjust to try to move solar siting to these more farm-friendly versions.
Yes, it's as it currently is in Massachusetts, there are certainly competing interests. So that limits the size of projects on conserved land, and something that is being worked through policy right now through the State House, increasing those limits, those limitation constraints. Because farmers are looking to diversify, of course, revenues, and this is a possible alternative that really has a really secure investment for them.
Thank you. One other question we have is, are the decommissioning costs figured into a 7-year payback time for farmers?
Yes, so that is definitely something for the leasing and power purchasing agreement, because towns are requiring that, which is something that is really important in forward thinking. And I think that's something that has been developed as solar industry has moved forward, because those early contracts might not have had those decommissioning costs included. For farmer owned, it's something that a consultant should be working with or notify the farmers of, that there is going to be a cost, at the end of this 20 years or 25 years, because it's not something that is so obvious. Of course, there are potentials for them to recoup some of that cost, especially recycling steel. And potentially, once the solar module recycling market starts to expand as these projects are decommissioned, there could be possible returns or incentives to recycle those modules. But decommissioning costs, especially for farmer owned, is something that should be made aware of.
But there is a chance that if they don't plan for that upon decommissioning, there would be quite a financial surprise.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Burden.
Absolutely. Both the physical labor and then the cost to actually recycle or dispose of materials.
Thank you. I think that is a good place to pause. I don't see any other questions that I've missed. Oh, I've missed one. Sorry. Oh, here we go. Sorry. I think this could maybe be for everybody on our presenters today. For the benefit of those on the call who may be from a municipality or a planning agency, are there zoning ordinances that help or hinder appropriate solar installations on farms and forests that you're aware of?
In Vermont, a lot of this is happening on the statewide level, so it's not about local zoning. There is some, I don't know how to put it, contribution or, the town plan gets consideration and actually deference if they have also made a plan for how they will meet the state's energy goals within that town. If they don't have a valid energy plan, then their finding whether a solar site is appropriate is not given preference, it's only given consideration, not deference. So there's not exactly a zoning thing, but it's a rights and responsibilities. If a town actually steps up and says, okay, we're going to be responsible for the energy use in our town by saying how we're going to get to the state's renewable goals, then they could even say, no, actually, we're going to get to the state's energy goals without doing any solar, and therefore we're not interested in solar in our town. That's theoretically possible. And the commission would have to mostly defer to the town on that. Other than that, that's very uncommon, and but that's how it works. If the town steps up and has a plan, then the town is deferred to. If not, then not. That's my understanding of it.
Thanks, Alex. We do hearing from John Roberts, who says that as a select board member in their town, they developed an ordinance that was to do with shielding the solar panels from neighbors. So the visibility issue,
right?
And that is, I think, a lot of the NIMBY issue that we see everywhere about not having to necessarily see the solar panels in your view.
And I see Nancy's got a great comment there too. That's exactly correct. Bennington had a very good plan about where they wanted it and where they didn't. And there was a case, I think, where it was put somewhere else, and the commission turned away the developer. I think that's how that worked.
Great. Well, thank you everybody that presented today. Thank you to Tyler and to Jake and to Alex and to Michael as part of Jake's presentation. We have a lot of information we've given you today. It's hopefully a lot to digest, and we'll provide you some resources. But what we would like you to take a moment to think about, and we're actually going to ask that you answer this poll in the chat, is think about one concrete step that you will take in your efforts to advance farmland protection and move solar siting policy in the direction you want to see it move. What might be something that you do, either whether it's coming to an additional workshop, perhaps researching the policies in your region or your town, becoming an advocate for policies that move solar in the direction where we can also protect farmland. Think about something that you'd be willing to do, that you'd like to do next. Go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll wait for a couple of moments, and then we'll begin the final wrap-ups of this workshop.
And I'll jump all at once.
Well, one thing that I see is promoting upcoming workshops, and we will share with you some upcoming workshops as well. So if you're not certain of your next concrete step, maybe it might be attending one of these next workshops that we will share with you.
Good stuff. So while people are putting that in the chat, maybe Megan, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so as folks are writing these great ideas in the chat, maybe we'll summarize those in a second. But as Emily said, I'll just take a moment to let you know about the remaining workshops coming up in this series. For the Vermont folks here on the call, we've got 2 more in this 5-part series. So the next one on September 10th, strategies and tools for making farmland available to farmers. You'll see some of us back on that call, including Steph Morningstar. It's going to be a really great conversation. We're going to hear from a lot of folks from Land for Good, from farmers, from staff. It's going to be a really powerful conversation. Then on the 23rd, learning about tools and resources specific to supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your town or community. So we really encourage you to come back, to invite all of your colleagues. There's no cap on that final one, so we really hope to get as many folks as possible to those last 2 upcoming workshops in this great series. Next slide, please.
And here are the upcoming Smart Solar Siting for New England Partnership Project webinars that I mentioned previously. You can go to that link if you'd like to register and read more about them. It's a 4-part series, once a week for 4 weeks, starting later in September, focusing on differing aspects, but there is definitely state-specific work in here. There's municipal level, there's state level, there's community level, and we invite you all to come and participate. And Alex, do you want to mention something about the solar energy in Vermont's working landscape workshop coming up?
Come one, come all. This is going to be a half day, and we will be talking a lot about pollinator friendly, environmentally friendly. How do jurisdictions get involved? Town planning, regional planning, some technology options, and really trying to come out of that with some breakout groups at the end to develop new policies. So what we're hoping to do is establish some momentum that will actually work on specific things coming out of this event. So especially if you're, doing work in Vermont, it would be very relevant.
Thanks, Alex. So lots of great comments now on what your concrete actions will be. I see a lot of increasing community engagement and increasing in advocacy and increasing in both personal education and also educating your community. And I think that is a baseline step that needs to be taken across the board, no matter what town or state or region you're in, learning more about these policies, how they can impact and how they can improve solar siting and improve community relations and improve both farm protection and clean energy goals. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to pass this off to Jamie for the wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much. And just to add, want to make sure to highlight Steph's comment there. She'd like to see how solar siting programs and policies can help benefit sovereign indigenous nations. And that's a really great question, Steph. And I look forward to getting into that with you more. So to wrap this up in the last 2 minutes, next slide, please. Just really want to give a very special thanks to today's presenters, Emily, Alex, Tyler, and Jake for sharing your wisdom with us. Want to thank all of our organizers as well who are here on the call with us, Nancy, Steph. This has just been a really great and very thorough presentation. I also just want to encourage you all, and I'm going to paste a link right here in the chat, to implore you to just literally pop this link open in your browser so you have it there. We really just wanted to get your feedback on your thoughts on how this workshop went. It would really mean the world to us. It'll help us improve this workshop over the next 2 days that we're doing for the other states, as well as enable us to better follow up with you about any further resources that you may want or need. So thank you in advance for that. We'll also be sending it around in an email along with the resource handout in the next day or so. And just, yeah, to end, and it's 11:29, so I'm very excited. We ended on time, but I just want to really wrap up by saying thanks again for being here with us today. Feel free to follow up with me or Emily or with any of the speakers here on the call. If you have any questions, we'll direct you to the right folks. And we really do hope to see you next week at the Making Farmland Available for Farmers workshop. And we just hope you have a really great day. Thanks again for being here, for your questions and contributions. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, everybody.